What's going on, everybody? It's Joel here, and today we're going to be doing the review of the Nike METCON 10. So I've been using these over the course of the last 3 weeks or so, using them just about every single day and pretty much any kind of workout situation that you could possibly think of. And I think it's time for me to give my final thoughts on what I thought about the performance of the METCON 10. But before we get into that, we're going to talk about the construction. So this year we have an open hold engineered mesh upper. It's very similar to the upper that was found on the Zoom METCON Turbo 2. On top of that engineered mesh, there are rubber overlays on top of the medial side toe box and also in the midfoot of the shoe, which acts as the new midfoot wrap. There's a rubber layer on the outside for protection and durability against rope climbs, and then there is a panel that goes through the inside of the shoe as well. So back to this mesh upper. They say that they gave it a little bit more width and volume compared to the METCON 9 per Nike's website, but when comparing the two, I found that the 9s still felt a little bit wider size for size. Now, I will say that I felt like the 9s also ran a half size big. They are just a bigger shoe in comparison to the METCON 10s. And I'll talk more about this when we get to the fit, but the METCON 10s do require a little bit of break-in, but after that, they do become similar in width to the METCON 9s. The upper on the 10s feels a little bit more lightweight, a little bit more flexible, like there's less bulk than that of the METCON 9s, but I didn't think that it was that much more breathable. It is slightly better, but I felt like my feet still got hot inside the METCON 10s. Now taking a look at the ankle collar and heel construction of the METCON 10s, we have a slightly lower ankle cut as well as a slightly lower heel cut. There is still a good amount of cushioning in there. I didn't run into any issues with heel slip with the shoe, and my ankle still felt pretty secure inside of it. There's definitely less bulk around this area compared to the METCON 9, and if you had issues with the heel rubbing against your Achilles, that probably won't be an issue with the METCON 10s. Now, one thing that I noticed and was kind of annoying about the METCON 10 heel construction was the fact that this material is a little bit on the dense side, and it always wants to bow outwards when you're lacing up your shoe, which can make it hard to get a nice tight fit around your ankle. So what I found was the remedy to that solution was I just took the top laces and flipped them through the outside of the shoe and laced them up that way so that I could get better back pressure when lacing the shoes up. The tongue on this shoe has a neat little trick compared to before, and that is that it has a little pocket that you can stuff your laces into. Now, you don't have to use that pocket, and if you wanted to, you could just flip it around and you'd never see it, or you can change the logo, or you can stuff the laces in the front side, or you can stuff the laces in the back side. It's much better than the Velcro that they were using on the 7s through 9s. The midsole this year is Nike's React X foam. Compared to last year's dual density foam, it feels a lot more responsive, and it is also more cushioned. It's a little bit softer than the dual density that was on the METCON 9. Now, it sounds like it would be a bad idea to put that on a training shoe, but I can assure you the responsiveness to me feels better than it did on the METCON 9's dual density, which kind of felt muddy at times. It was pretty dense when you're doing slow lifts, but when you got to Olympic weightlifting and barbell cycling movements, I always felt like it threw my timing off. The React X foam feels more tactile to me than the dual density setup of the 9, despite even feeling a little bit more cushioned. Now, there's no official word on what the heel-toe offset is on the METCON 10s, but every flagship METCON has always had a 4mm drop, so I don't think that they would have changed it for the METCON 10s. Plus, to me and my feet, it feels like it's a 4mm drop, also comparing it to shoes that have higher drops. Now, taking a look at the outsole of the METCON 10s, we have a few different rubber placements and we have a new tread pattern. There is no more herringbone tread pattern. We now have a more flat contact triangular tread pattern, and we have the 004 sticky rubber in the forefoot, which has some breaks in it for flexibility. It's decoupled from the midfoot rubber, which seems to be just like a harder wearing rubber. And then we have the 004 sticky rubber at the heel part of the shoe. The grip, most noticeably in the front and the back of the shoe, is very, very good. It's decent in the middle, but where you're gonna notice it the most is the front and the back. And if you just kind of put your foot down and start sliding it around, you'll see that the middle doesn't grip quite as good as the fronts and the backs. Now, I think the reasoning for that is because you have a harder rubber here for rope climb durability. And on the outside edge of that rubber, it's a sharper edge. On the inside, it's a more radiused edge. Now, the reason why you would want that is because you still get the grip from the outside when climbing the rope, but you have the ability to slide down the rope with relative ease using the more rounded edge. I felt like these were great rope climbing shoes. Now, a lot of shoes nowadays do pretty good on rope climb ascents, but when it comes to descents with a sharp edge in the inside, what happens is that shoe will want to pull off your feet. That wasn't the case with the METCON 10s. I had no issues sliding down the rope in these shoes. The only problem that I ran into was the fact that there is some exposed foam on the medial side of the shoe, and that burned through on my test pair. Now, structurally, I don't think that that's going to affect the shoe too much, but it does kind of look a little bit ugly. Another thing that I noticed was that the rubber on the midfoot wrap did not show any wear. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to construction of the METCON 10s is the fact that these are very light training shoes by today's standards. I got a men's size 10.5 and I weighed it in at 341 grams or 12 ounces. That is very light compared to the 14 ounces of the METCON 9, which is pretty much the average weight of training shoes nowadays. So while almost every other shoe is going up in weight, I'm very glad that Nike took the care to bring down the weight of the METCON 10s. 2 ounces might not sound like a lot of weight, but it is definitely noticeable when you're doing longer sets of burpees, box jumps, and especially for me, running. So when it comes to sizing your METCON 10s, in my first impressions video, I said that I thought the METCON 10s felt more narrow than the METCON 9s. After a lot of wear and break-in, I think the METCON 10s are probably just about as wide as the METCON 9s. But I will say the METCON 9s, just in general, still feel like they're a little bit big. Maybe a little bit under a half size big, but they definitely do run bigger than the METCON 10s. So if you're somebody that always wears the same size METCONs and you just kind of dealt with the fact that the METCON 9s felt a little bit big, I'm gonna recommend that you go with that same size with the METCON 10s. If you're somebody that felt like the METCON 9s ran large and you had to size them down compared to the rest of your METCONs, then I'm gonna recommend that you go with a half size back up to your normal METCON size. Now, sizing these compared to some of the other shoes out there, I feel like they size pretty similarly to Rad V2s, but with a little bit more width and volume in the toe box. Comparing the sizing to CXT2s is kind of a mixed bag because CXT2s can run slightly large or they can just be normal. The safe bet is to just go with the same size that you would in your CXT2s, and I think that that will be okay. Now, I want to reiterate that these shoes require a little bit of breaking in. So an initial step in, they're probably going to feel a little bit snug, but they loosen up a lot. And I feel like at this point, the METCON 10s have opened up a very, very good amount. They are, to me, what I would consider a wide training shoe. There's plenty of space in the toe box, both width and volume wise. And I don't feel like the 10.5 feels narrow at all anymore. Another thing that also breaks in that I kind of commented about was the arch pressure. That is almost non-existent anymore. I don't even think about it anymore when I put my feet inside of these shoes. So that's not something that going forward after wearing your shoes, you're gonna have to worry about anymore. Okay, so the number one asked question in the comment section of my first impressions video was, are they good for running? And I have to say that that answer is a surprising yes. These are some of the best training shoes to run in right now. The React X foam, while still being on the dense side compared to running shoes, is very, very comfortable in these shoes. Not only that, the flexibility of them is insane compared to any other METCON in the past. So with the last 3 iterations of the METCON, we had the built-in hyperlift plate, which is still there this time around, but it's just encapsulated inside of the heel phone. But it is much more cut down than the previous 3 versions. Now I will say that these are still training shoes, and I still wouldn't recommend them for any kind of run over a couple miles maybe, but I have willingly used these for my running workouts, and I never really thought twice about it. It took me one run in them for me to really believe that these were actually good training shoes to run in. Another reason why I like these for running is because they're actually lightweight compared to other training shoes. So combine the fact that there's the responsive and also decently cushioned React X foam that's giving you a bit of energy return. Very good flexibility, especially for a METCON or any other training shoe for that matter. Plus the fact that these are almost as light as a normal running shoe. You've got yourself a really good training shoe to run in. Now you can take those same characteristics and apply them directly to what these shoes feel like to be doing agility movements and plyometric movements. And I thought these were extremely comfortable for longer sets of burpees. They're still very responsive and stable when you're doing box jumps, double unders. I had no issues tracking the rope after longer sets of double unders when your feet just get really tired. And I was never left feeling like I wanted to take my shoes and throw them across the room after a longer agility or body weight movement workout. I know this is subjective, but to me, these are some of the most comfortable training shoes you can get at the moment. But of course, that's kind of a double-edged sword, because when you have a more flexible, more cushioned shoe, you start to take away from how they do when it comes to lifting. Which, if that's something that you're buying training shoes specifically to do, the METCON 10s might not be the best option out there. Now going back to the Hyperlift insert, because it is a lot more slimmed down than the last 3 versions of the shoe, you're gonna notice that the heel is gonna wanna flex, and it's gonna wanna flex more front and back and also torsionally. Now, when it comes to compression, I didn't really notice that the heel compressed that much. It is a little bit softer than the last 3 versions, but I don't think that's something that's really gonna detract from the overall power delivery of the shoe. What you're gonna notice the most is the fact that the shoes are gonna wanna flex a little bit more, both torsionally and front to back. I didn't have any issues with responsiveness when I was doing my barbell cycling movements. I actually thought that Olympic weightlifting in these shoes felt very good because of the more tactile, more responsive foam. It didn't really muddy down my lifts at all. And I thought landings were overall still very stable in this shoe. The only areas that I noticed that the shoe was not as stable as other training shoes was when it came to some of my slower lifts, when the weight was a little bit or a lot more heavy than what I was doing for my Olympic weightlifting movements. I could feel myself, or I could feel the shoe wanting to flex more at the midfoot when I was doing a really heavy deadlift or a really heavy squat. But you have to be a little bit more aware that because the shoes are just generally more flexible than any of the previous METCONs, and even some of the current top training shoes, that the shoe is gonna allow your foot to flex a lot more with it as well. Now, that's not something that you can't correct. And honestly, I don't think that that is going to be a make it or break it between a lot of lifts. It's just something to take into consideration, especially if you're buying a training shoe for the sole purpose of lifting weights. But even still, I don't think that the difference in stability between the METCON 10s and some of the other top training shoes is that far off. Okay, so the METCON 10s retail for $155. That's a $5 increase over the MSRP of the METCON 9, which is to be expected considering today's economy, but is still in line with pretty much any other training shoe out there. So why would you pick the METCON 10s over some of its competition? Compared to the Rad V2, which is a very, very, very close second for me right now. Number 1 at the moment would be METCON 10s. And the reason why I choose the METCON 10s over the Rad V2 is because I think that they offer very similar performance in terms of flexibility and stability, though I still think that the V2s are the more stable shoe. The thing that drives me towards the METCON 10s is the fact that they are a lot lighter. So running in this shoe for me feels much better than it did in the V2s, which I was not a fan of running in because I thought that they were just a little bit on the heavier side. Another reason why you would want to choose the METCON 10s is that they are also quite a bit wider than the Rad V2s. Now comparing these to the CXT2s, which are another one of my favorite training shoes to use at the moment, I would pick the METCON 10s if you were looking for a flexible training shoe. Once again, these are a lot more flexible and a lot easier to run in than the CXT2s, which are just, to me, not a very good running shoe at all. They're decently flexible in the toe box, so you can get away with doing burpees and box jumps. But when it comes to like running, the overall makeup of the shoe is just very rigid, but that makes it a much better lifting shoe than the METCON 10s. That is by far the best training shoe to lift in at the moment. So if that is your sole purpose in buying a training shoe, then I would recommend going with that. Another top training shoe right now is the F-Lite or F-Lite Max from Innovate, which I would recommend if you had very, very wide toes. Those are probably the widest training shoe at the moment. That is also a very good training shoe. I would use those in just about any situation that I would use the METCON 10. They're also very comfortable, they're very flexible, and they are also just as lightweight as the METCON 10s. One thing that I prefer on the METCON 10s is the fact that the METCON 10s are a 4mm drop shoe and they just have a more flat feel throughout. The Innovates kind of have a little bit of a toe spring, which I don't really care for. Plus, the width is kind of wasted on me because I feel like I'm just kind of swimming around in those shoes. And of course, comparing these to the METCON 9s, which were just not one of my favorite training shoes at all, these are more breathable, they're a lot more lightweight, they're a lot more flexible. They're, in my opinion, better for Olympic lifts. I would say that for slower lifts, the METCON 9s are probably a little bit better, but I also think that the fit of the METCON 10s fits me better than the METCON 9s. Overall, the METCON 10s are a huge upgrade in my eyes compared to the METCON 9s. And if you're asking me, I think the METCON 10s are probably my favorite METCON of all time now. These really do it all. They're stable enough, they are comfortable, and I think the whole package of the METCON 10 is probably the best that we've ever seen from Nike at this point, which is a huge comeback compared to the METCON 9s, which to me were not the greatest training shoe, and I think a lot of people out there felt that same sentiment. So huge win from Nike, and I'm glad that they took a lot of the criticisms and feedback that people had, myself included, about the METCON 9s and improved them with the METCON 10s. Another huge shout out to Box Basics for sending me out both pairs of METCON 10s to review. If you want to support me, make sure that you guys pick up your METCON 10s at Box Basics. Support the people that support me. If you guys have any questions about the METCON 10s, feel free to leave them in the comment section. And as always, guys, please hit that like button, subscribe, and thanks for watching.